When the session ends, the admin begins. From progress notes to insurance claims, managing a practice takes time. Simple Practice is the all-in-one EHR built specifically for therapists to streamline your workflow and give you your hours back.
Start with a 7-day free trial, then get 50% off your first 3 months. Just go to simplepractice.com.
What if you could stop being the office manager, bookkeeper, marketing director, and tech support all at once and just be the therapist?
Buying Time has helped therapists, providing an entire team of specialists who manage the details behind the scenes. Download their free systems inventory checklist at buyingtimellc.com/MTSG.
You're listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide, where therapists live, breathe, and practice as human beings. To support you as a whole person and a therapist, here are your hosts, Curt and Katie Vernoy.
Welcome back, Modern Therapists. This is Modern Therapist Survival Guide. I'm Curt with Katie Vernoy, and this is the podcast for therapists about the things going on in our profession, the things going on in our world, and depending on which corner of the internet that you are spending your time in, artificial intelligence is either going to be the savior of all things psychotherapy, or this is the beginning of some very apocalyptic sci-fi sort of movie. And there are all kinds of things that are being made up about what artificial intelligence can do, what it is doing, and what it could possibly be doing, not only on a technological standpoint, but also to our careers and our professions. And so we are joined today by Arul and Shirali Nigam from Circuit Breaker Labs to talk about artificial intelligence and their quest to go out and break it. So that way, by the time that it comes to the ways that we interact with these tools with our clients, that it has a good stamp of approval and is doing what it tells us that it's doing. So thank you so much for spending some time with us and talking about the work that you're doing.
Thank you for having us, Curt. Thank you, Katie. We're really excited.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation. And we literally met in an elevator, and you guys had a great elevator pitch. And I joked with the people I was with, I was like, that is where this phrase came from, is people who can say what they do in the time it takes to go from one floor to the next. But I'll stop gushing and allow you to introduce yourself by asking you the question I ask all our guests, which is, who are you and what are you putting out into the world?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so glad we met and excited to share more about what we're doing. I'm Shirali. I'm Arul's co-founder and older sister. We're building Circuit Breaker Labs, basically autonomously pressure testing any AI that's going to interact with people to find hidden mental health vulnerabilities, so that when real people are using these systems, like it does no harm for them. My background is biomedical engineering, so I spent some time doing research in like the neuroscience space at NIH, Art Hughes Medical Institute's Genelia campus, the Wyss Institute up at Harvard, and then I got my MBA from Wharton. Arul brings our AI intelligence.
So yeah, my name is Arul. I'm Shirali's co-founder and younger brother. As she mentioned, I have more of the technical AI research experience. Did a bunch at Georgetown and at various organizations during college in a lot of adjacent domains to mental health. So it's been interesting bringing that and applying it to the mental health space, learning a lot and seeing the great things that people are building.
We've talked about artificial intelligence on and off for the last couple of years on the podcast here. And in our experience of talking with our listeners, talking with a bunch of other people in our field, this might be too broad of a question because I hear extremes in all directions of this. But what are, from your perspective, are therapists usually getting wrong when they're worrying about artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so I think something really important to keep in mind is that AI, like very few people are using AI to replace human therapy. Typically, they're using it to replace no therapy. Like we haven't really seen any scaled cases where people have a great relationship with a real therapist and then they're like, no, I don't want this anymore. I want to use ChatGPT. It's meant as a supplement to the wild access to care crisis that we're all too familiar with. And so I think AI as a replacement for, as a way for people to access care, and then hopefully as a gateway to real human therapy and humans in the loop is a reason to be excited. But that being said, where a lot of people are right is that the AI tools that people are using now, of course, they're nowhere close to a real therapist, but in many cases, their safety infrastructure is so weak that they could be more damaging than not seeking therapy at all. We've seen these cases where chatbots are validating or sometimes tragically even encouraging young people, in particular, their suicidal ideation. And so, or self-harm or a broad set of risky behaviors. And so our goal with what we're doing at Circuit Breaker Labs is, as you put it, breaking them when they're still in development to make sure that those real vulnerabilities never make it to real users. And so that can be a supplement to human therapy, or like I said, a gateway to human therapy, but definitely not a total replacement.
I think it might also be helpful, because this is a question that I usually get when I'm talking about ethics and artificial intelligence. But when you talk about artificial intelligence, what are you referring to?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's two kind of core differences to artificial intelligence that is like not something very well publicized beyond like the AI community. And that's the difference between deterministic AI and generative AI. Deterministic AI is much safer because it's responding in a very constrained way versus generative AI. You're looking at probability and patterns to predict the next token. And what that means is when someone is interacting with an AI chatbot, you can feed it the same input 20 times and on the 21st get a vastly different output. And that is why like the risk scales so much with the AIs that we're seeing today, because they're based on generative AI. So that could be an AI chatbot like these foundational model providers we see like OpenAI, Anthropic. It could be an application that is building on top of OpenAI's infrastructure to solve a very specific use case. So kind of fine-tuning OpenAI to, for example, help administer like exercises in between provider sessions. But there's a whole other set of AIs that are coming and aren't here yet, and that's like hardware-enabled embodied systems. We've seen some stuff of companies coming out recently in terms of like stuffed animal interfaces and thinking a longer term about robotics and those kinds of applications, which are also rooted in the same generative AI mechanism. So it's the same kind of infrastructure that will need to be safety tested, but will manifest in a lot of different form factors.
So you're talking about the evolution of AI from these deterministic models where, it's A equals B equals C, kind of it goes down a strategy to this generative AI, which it's not the Wild West, but when you talk about it, it feels a little bit like the Wild West. And then even progressing further into this stuffed animal or robot that now has an even more likely opportunity for somebody to anthropomorphize it and have some sort of connection to it. This sounds really risky. And it's something where I recognize when I'm trying to break something with my limited skills that there's different risks when someone's using ChatGPT versus a mental health created AI platform. And so maybe if you can just kind of talk through what this problem is, like let's really fully kind of address what is this safety problem when we're looking at AI for mental health, whether it's the designated use case or if it's someone saying, well, ChatGPT gave me some really good advice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we have seen that has been really interesting is these mental health specific chatbots. They're designed on top of the foundational models, but they're meant to bring in more clinical insight. But anytime this chatbot is coming from a reputed provider or some resource where people already have trust in the resource, the trust gets kind of shifted to the chatbot as well. And so in some cases, people are more open when they're talking to these mental health chatbots because they are like, oh, it's coming from a resource I already trust. And so one thing to be careful about there is like, of course, the kinds of conversations that might happen on those platforms are different. But fortunately, And because they are being built hand in hand with experts, with clinicians, with therapists, they're able to detect more vulnerabilities and they have more robust safeguards than some of these general purpose models. When we think about the general purpose models, it really comes down to the training data. There was an interesting study recently that a lot of the data that feeds these foundational models today has come from like Reddit or like not reputed sources in terms of like that real clinical insight. And so what we need to do for safety is make sure that when it comes down to making a decision of how you're going to respond to someone who might be showing, indications of imminent suicidal risk, that the answer that the chatbot is going to give them is something that pulls from clinical insight and not just something that the training data found on the internet. And so as we're thinking about safety, we're trying to work with clinicians and experts in this space to really understand how these conversations emerge so that people building, whether they're building a general purpose chatbot or they're building a custom like mental health chatbot, it's really representative of the population at large and representative of how a clinician would interact with this person in real life, how they would direct them to care, how they would respond in crises. Because right now the chatbots are designed to just be very agreeable, which is not necessarily what everybody needs all the time.
Let's talk about why Curt and I both use Simple Practice. Simple Practice is an all-in-one EHR that is HIPAA compliant, high-trust certified, and built specifically for therapists.
For me, it's the integrated client communication. Messages from clients land straight in the chart, so I'm not copying things over from 3 different apps or emails or trying to remember who said what where.
For me, one of the things that saved me gigantic headaches is insurance billing. It was simple back when I was in network, and it stayed just as simple now that I'm out of network doing courtesy billing for my clients. That used to be the thing I dreaded most, and now it just runs. And if you're just starting out or growing your practice, they also have a credentialing service that helps you get paneled independently.
It takes the total headache out of insurance enrollment, giving you full autonomy over your own contracts without any middleman platforms taking a cut.
If you're ready to simplify the business side of your practice, now's the perfect time to try Simple Practice.
Start with a 7-day free trial, then get 50% off your first 3 months. Just go to simplepractice.com to claim the offer. Again, that's simplepractice.com. So some of the guardrails that get put in are regulatory. Some of it is, I'm assuming, well wishes and good hopes that the developers of these kinds of programs are doing their moral and ethical duty. What other kinds of guardrails are there that get put in? We've heard about large language models as having some of the limitations that have pushed more of this towards generative AI as kind of a direction. But what kind of guardrails do you, as experts in creating guardrails, look for as helping to make these more robust?
Absolutely. I think one of the great developments that we've seen recently is kind of the implementation of like a lifeguard model, so to speak. So you have your standard model that is giving your normal responses, the main chatbot that people think of. But then you have this lifeguard model sitting on top, kind of watching the user inputs. And then if they see some sign of like risky behavior coming in and intervening, that honestly is the best, like one of the best approaches that we have right now. But there are a couple of problems with that. One is like developers are sometimes hesitant to include that, or even if they include that, it's in a pretty minimal way because these are consumer apps and they don't want to increase, latency because that drives down retention and user engagement. So there's some resistance on that front. Even with with the models, or even with the lifeguard model, if it's too clearly if it's not working enough, that's a problem because risky interactions can happen. But the other kind of interesting and unfortunate phenomenon is we found that if the guardrails are too sensitive and if there's a remote sign of risk, it just says like, hey, I can't continue the conversation, please call 988. If it just gives that standard response with like any remote sign of risk, then what people like people aren't always going to call 988. A lot of the time they'll say, hey, like this clinical AI isn't even helpful for me. I should just go back to ChatGPT because it doesn't terminate the conversation. It keeps talking to me. It helps me feel better, helps me feel calm. Whether or not, ChatGPT's approach is right, and it's, definitely not like clinically informed. So kind of striking that balance is an interesting challenge. And it's honestly, even beyond the technical level, it's kind of like a philosophical debate. Like how should the model respond? Like, should it terminate the conversation even if it means the user is going to go to a worse model? Should it continue the conversation but try to use whatever like clinical techniques it can? An idea that I'm really fascinated by is similar to as if like if someone was to call like a hotline number, look at like what are the first few things that the counselor on the other end of the call says to coach the person to even be amenable to help in the first place. And what if we can bring that to the chatbot so that instead of just terminating the conversation, they bring the user to be able to actually call the hotline, or maybe even like for the chatbots that are better resourced and have a network of clinicians, maybe escalate the conversation to a real human. Say like, hey, I can tell you're in crisis and I can't handle this any further, but I can put you on the phone right now with a human that you can talk to and they're an expert. They'll help you with this. One of the tragedies we've seen, I believe with the Zane Shamlin case with OpenAI, ChatGPT basically hallucinated that feature. So it said like, okay, I'm going to connect you to a real human now. And so then he kept on talking. And then eventually he was like, wait, are you a real human? Like, am I talking to a human? And then ChatGPT says, oh no, my bad. Like I made that up. So, and with the Zane Shamlin case, tragically, like he went on to take his life. So I think clearly that implementation was wrong. But if we could really actualize that and help, like I said, use these chatbots as a gateway to human support when it makes sense, that would be tremendously valuable, because chatbots just are not equipped to handle like serious crisis, like imminent risk conversations.
Chatbots are available 24/7, except when they take a long time to load because of, a lifeguard in the background. It sounds like they are very quick to respond. And I find sometimes so sycophantic that they're not helpful. I think there are folks who find huge help in how do I respond to this problematic email or this problematic text, or what should I do about this, or teach me the CBT principles for X problem, right? And I think those things can be psychoeducational. And this crisis response use case feels very dangerous. It also feels hopeful in that somebody could get help from something that can generate some helpful responses when most humans aren't available. But even in saying, "Hey, call 988," there's, we've had episodes on sometimes the training's not there, sometimes it's not staffed full enough, sometimes people are on hold. And so those things are less useful. And so I get worried that it's kind of I had the weirdest metaphor come into my mind. It's kind of like when you're trying to grow out bangs. It's like we're it's not bangs, but it's not fully grown, and so it's just a mess right now. And so how do you approach this middle space where we're starting to get some guardrails, but they can be problematic? We're getting usefulness from these chatbots theoretically that's improving and may have some really promising things, but there's this risky place that we're in where they're not quite good enough and the guardrails aren't quite good enough.
In terms of how these developers are thinking about safety, the standard approach is to find guardrails and implement them, or to manually try and pressure test the system. But it almost feels like this problem needed to be solved a year ago, and we're really playing catch up, and we need to have a solution that's going to almost fix the safety overnight. Like, we can't wait for those bangs to grow out. It needs to be solved already. And so I think the way we've kind of approached it in terms of how we think about accelerating the implementation of robust safety is this kind of like helping deploy clinical insight at scale. So working with these experts to understand how different risks can emerge, what the possible scenarios look like, and giving chatbot developers a way to really ensure that, okay, I've not just tested 10 perfectly formed sentences. I've tested 100,000 sentences that have typos. They have ways that a teenager is going to express something and how an elderly person might express something, different references and nuance that actually represent the population and not just the training data is extremely important. And so when we think about kind of the different ways that people are approaching safety, I think it's something that it needs to be in the foundation. If you build a building with a weak foundation, doesn't matter if it gets to like 100 floors, it's still not going to be a solid building. So helping, the way we kind of think about like our pressure testing tool, we want to help developers who are just starting their chatbot development bake that like clinical insight and stress testing in at the start so that they are building guardrails that are actually going to help their users. And to Arul's point about like latency and user engagement, if we run 100,000 tests and show them that their model consistently fails in this like area, they're much more receptive to, okay, it's okay if we increase our latency a little bit because this is a real risk that could hurt people. And I think when we think about it like from our perspective, the experts' perspectives that we work with, the developers' perspectives, we're unified in this one mission of we want AI to do no harm, but it's just like how we actually make that happen. And, like the way the safest AIs are going to be built are by working with the domain experts who know what the like developers don't know so that they can really model these interactions early on and ensure that they're not like, people say in the startup world, build fast and break something, but this is not a domain where we want to break anything. And so we need to have this pressure testing very early on so real people aren't bearing the brunt of our pursuit of fast innovation.
Let's be real. Most therapists don't need more tools. They need more support. And it's not just one person they have to hire, train, and manage. When you work with Buying Time, you're getting an entire team of specialists with expertise in admin, bookkeeping, marketing, automation, and client support. I've been a happy client since 2015, and that team approach has made all the difference. Buying Time supports therapists with all the behind-the-scenes work that keeps your practice running smoothly.
Here's what sets Buying Time apart. Many virtual support companies charge you to find a VA, then leave you to manage that person yourself. With Buying Time, you're not paying for recruiting, you're getting a fully managed team. That means no worrying about who's handling what, no scrambling when someone is unavailable, and no spending your evenings following up on unfinished tasks. You have one trusted partner backed by a team of experts. And because they believe your business should run efficiently, they've created a free systems inventory checklist to help you uncover hidden expenses, eliminate unnecessary software, and simplify your systems. Visit buyingtimellc.com/MTSG to download your free checklist today. I know from older computer developers or software developers that the way that they would stress test something, if a form asked, how many of an item would you want to order, they'd test it out by typing in 32, 8 million, 0, -5, purple, in kind of this very manual and methodical sort of way. How do you stress test 100,000 things in a way that is being able to help develop at the speed of today's artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so by automating our approach, we're able to test a lot more than a human could in a fraction of the time. With with the example you mentioned, like manually typing it, like of course you have to do that quality assurance in development and you have to write your tests, but it's slow and there's only so many that you could think of. And even like let's say someone even wrote like an automated testing script. It's hard, especially for startups, to be able to integrate expertise from a lot of people. Like, maybe someone will try and imagine like how might a user express suicidal ideation or some sort of risky message. But we fully automate that end to end. And so we've talked with many different clinicians from different geographic backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different modalities and philosophies of therapy. So trying to integrate as many different perspectives as we can, including conflicting perspectives, and basically through our tool, making that expertise available to any developer who wants it, instead of them manually having to go out and like hire a bunch of clinicians to manually do it. And so we bring in that clinical insight, and then we also have like interesting, semantic and natural language approaches that Shirali mentioned for how we integrate things like slang or typos or age and cultural variation. So the way someone who speaks English as second language expresses suicidal ideation is different than a native English speaker, or the way a 16-year-old expresses suicidal ideation is different from even an 18-year-old, let alone like a 30-year-old or a 70-year-old. Like there's just such a wide breadth of linguistic diversity in the way that people are interacting with chatbots. So we integrate all of that into, sort of our simulation engine. And then developers plug into our tool in basically just 10 lines of code. And then we will basically autonomously simulate these conversations. So kind of taking on the persona of, a specific patient with like, we'll include like their diagnosis, their personal and medical history, what like cultural aspects they might be expressing, and then simulating like a realistic multi-turn conversation based on what we actually see. It's very rare that just straight out the gate in a single prompt, someone is going to explicitly say like, I'm about to harm myself, or, like very explicitly like naming the self-harm. Usually it's nuanced, and usually it's much later in the conversation. Sometimes they might even be talking about, like their school homework, like something totally different, like not even relevant. And at a technical level, when the conversations get really long and there's like a lot of these different topics, you experience something called context pollution, where basically like the context window of the model is filling up or running out of space. And at that point, the model can really go haywire, totally stop adhering to its guardrails. It's a lot easier to manipulate it on the 100th message versus like the first message. And most of the evals that are out there in the research, like Shirali mentioned, are like 5 perfectly formed sentences that nobody would ever say. And it's just like tested in a single turn. Ours is really based on how people are expressing this in the real world, and it's dynamic. So it'll, ask a question about like methods of self-harm, and then maybe the model will refuse the first time, but then it'll, continue the conversation on a different branch, and then maybe ask the original question in a different way. And like really almost, I hate to say like adversarial, because like not to blame the patient, but in like other forms of stress testing, they call it adversarial jailbreaking. So sort of trying to like intentionally break the model, which is what we're doing, to reveal those vulnerabilities before a real user finds those vulnerabilities and something really bad could happen. So it's kind of dynamically simulating these really long conversations, but bringing in all the different contexts and aspects that make it a realistic conversation, not like, like a pristine conversation that's like literally made in a lab.
What I'm getting out of this is you've essentially created a tool that is kind of how teenagers get around using the word suicide on TikTok by calling it unalive. And you're having a database for companies developing AI to say, here's all of the possible ways that people might get around being able to directly do this. And rather than you reinventing this wheel, here's a wheel that is going to try and get around everything that you're trying to do.
Exactly. And also like, it's not just the data set, but we take that data set and apply it for them. So they just plug in our tool, and every time they, push a new code update or they're about to change their tools, typically like they'll have a set of, tests that automatically run to check for security vulnerabilities, efficiency, just like general health of the tool. And so they can, like, one option is that they can just add this as part of that. Like before Like it has to pass this security check and this check and that check. And one more check it has to pass is that our model is not encouraging or validating, suicidal ideation. And so we take that data set and actually apply it autonomously for them. And we're able to run hundreds of thousands of, parallel conversations to pressure test the model from every angle and reveal those really remote edge cases that might not show up in manual human stress testing, but at the scale we're running it, like we can find those early so nobody gets hurt.
What are you finding in doing these stress tests?
Yeah, it's actually been very interesting. I think when Arul and I started building this, we just assumed it was going to be impossible to get a model to say anything bad. And we were going to be spending hours on end trying to figure out jailbreaks. But unfortunately, it's alarmingly easier to get bad outputs from models than one would expect. With the testing we've done so far, we test a lot of like the foundational models to kind of see what developers are building on top of, where the baseline starts, so that as they're building their tools, they're kind of already aware of some of the vulnerabilities that they're inheriting. And, like there's these like stereotypes that Anthropic's the safest, Grok's like the least safe. And while there's some truth to that, I think all the models are much less safe than we have imagined, particularly around like when we're running these test cases. There'll be times when you incorporate like a typo or refer to something in a more nuanced way that it will completely miss it. But to me, what is more alarming is that when we run that same test 100 times, there's so much variation that it's like, okay, like maybe the test that we've run, like, or like that developers have run when building the model, like they passed, but that repeatability really shows like the incredible variance that models can have because of like the way they're built, the probabilistic nature of a large language model. And so I think, what like all the model providers like could really like do better on is increasing like their breadth of testing, because when we run these like initial set of like 10 cases, it seems like, okay, they're catching most of the vulnerabilities. But the second you expand that to like hundreds or thousands or try and run repeated tests, the variance is extremely high. And then just to add to that point, like when we look at like semantic variations of, like the same condition, the same like similar patient history, but how people might express it differently based on like their age or demographics. I think like those things that we hypothesized around what's missing in the training data and how that might affect model responses, we're really seeing that magnified, and that it just suddenly becomes so easy to bypass the guardrails when you incorporate a little bit of nuance. Or one of the examples we found in our testing was acetaminophen. Like sometimes that can be a more imminent risk indicator for suicidal ideation than the word suicide. But if you spell it wrong, it can get past the guardrails. And this was like a pure accident fine because it's a hard word to spell. And I accidentally spelled it wrong when I was putting it into the model. And so I think like these kinds of things around like typos and things like that, like we need to bring in like the clinical insight into our safety testing and then scale these variations, because for chatbot developers, having clinicians look at like where the vulnerabilities are, that is the most valuable way that we can engage them. We shouldn't be asking clinicians to like sit there and come up with 100 different ways to say the same thing. Like, no, we need their insight on how do we fix this, that kind of philosophical component that Arul was talking about. It like, what are the best modalities to implement, not having them do like these kind of repetitive tasks. And so by doing this at scale, we're able to kind of give them a concrete set of like data to work off of and decide what the best practices are for these developers to implement.
Regulation-wise, there's a lot of legislation that's been proposed. Some of it has been passed. On the legal end of things, Katie and I were a couple of the members of the Camped Ethics Committee who helped push out an updated code of ethics. And a lot of this is bringing kind of the human in the loop aspects to some of the oversight, kind of the lifeguard approach that Arul was talking about earlier. I want to talk both about kind of the regulatory landscape here a little bit, and then follow up with what does this actually mean for clinicians? So, first, what is the regulatory landscape that you're seeing when it comes to the reasons why companies should be using circuit breaker? So I'll start there.
Yeah, absolutely. And appreciate the plug. So for context, we're based just outside of DC. And so we've been fortunate to have a lot of opportunities to engage with members of Congress, engage with their staff, engage with federal agencies. And AI and mental health is interestingly one of the rare areas of bipartisan consensus in DC. And so I think we'll probably see the most developed federal action on AI in the mental health realm specifically. There's been a lot, as you alluded to, there's been a lot of interesting regulation in the space. Like some of it is about how people represent their, credentials. There's a problem where chatbots sometimes hallucinate credentials. So a user is talking and then it'll say yeah, I'm a licensed therapist. Here's my number. And then you look it up and it's they just picked someone randomly. So one problem is dealing with that, making sure they're not misrepresenting credentials. In terms of the problem that we're specifically focused on, there are a lot of competing policy recommendations and approaches that people from both sides of the aisles and different committees have. But I think the core thread, and first of all, just stepping back, I think that's a really positive thing that we should be happy about, that there's so much attention and so much discussion on the space. But I think the core thread through all of those is it's regulators are not going to be satisfied by people saying I felt like my model wasn't safe, so instead of using Grok, I started using Claude. It's not enough to just put all of the responsibility on the foundational model that the developers pick, or even if developers are implementing their own lifeguard model or internal safety tooling, which is great and everyone should do that, and we're happy to see that a lot of people are. Just doing it is, again, not enough to satisfy regulators. The common thread is that they want third-party validation. They want third-party auditing. And the reason, Curt, to your point, that people should use circuit breaker labs from a compliance standpoint is so you have that third-party validation and are able to pressure test your model. But I think what we've been fortunate to see is that unlike in other industries, developers in this, people who are building chatbots to support mental health, are not greedy, and they're not oh, this is another hoop I have to jump through, it's just another compliance checkbox. Even before regulation, they care a lot about the problem, which is why they're building in this space, and nobody wants these tragedies to happen. And so that's why we actually thought we would have to do a lot of customer education coming into this, but every developer we talk to says this problem keeps us up at night. And we've looked for other solutions, but we just haven't found a great way to really reveal these vulnerabilities early on, which is why we want to help them, because they're doing this out of the goodness of their heart. It doesn't even have to be a business use case. They're building because they care about the mental health of their users and patients. And so we don't want this to be a headache for them, where our goal is to kind of own this end to end and take it off of their plate so that they can get back to building what they really want to and what they really care about, while knowing that it's safe, and then also being able to prove the safety of their tool to regulators, industry groups, clinicians who are deciding what tool should I recommend to my patient for in between session. And then also ultimately, and most importantly, users or parents of users who are deciding what's safe to use, what should I let my child use. Our goal is to kind of be that trust layer and that trustworthy validation that people can, have the peace of mind, okay, this tool is Circuit Breaker Labs certified.
So with what the typical clinician knows, a lot of the human in the loop, the ethics guidelines that we've put out there is clinicians should be familiar with these tools. you're talking at a level that is well beyond what the typical clinician is, and even the maybe hobbyists into AI clinicians are going to know. What is your advice as far as for clinicians to be able to understand the tools and the risks that come along with it, as far as any time that some of these apps get updated? What does this look like in clinical practice from your end based on the technical knowledge of most mental health providers?
Yeah, I think, what we would love to have at some point is like a leaderboard of we run tests on chatbots every day. You can look at where their safety is, which ones are safe to recommend to your patients. But I think right now there's just so much conflicting information around like what the standards we need to benchmark against are, what the cadence of these benchmarks need to be, especially in terms of like the larger providers. Every time they make an update to something on their system, even if it's not supposed to affect the safety aspect, it could. And so there's just a lot of information we don't know about the safety of these different AI chatbots right now. And so it's really hard to find a good resource of where to get this. I would say that a lot of like the learnings that we've had have been from pressure testing and seeing the vulnerabilities in real time. And so I would really just encourage anyone interested in the space to really like play around with the technology, see how like, your patients talk to you, what happens if they were trying to talk to ChatGPT and what vulnerabilities you see. And, on that note, like we work like with as many clinicians who would like to work with us. So really trying to help get those insights and see like where the vulnerabilities are, because I think, you know, you all know this domain the best. You know how these conversations are going to emerge. You know, like how, if anyone were going to make a prediction of how someone's going to have this conversation with a chatbot, you all are like the best suited to make a good prediction on that. And so in order to actually have good information on safety, I think we really need to bring more clinicians into both the human in the loop aspect of like looking at things real time as they're happening, how you escalate it to them, but even into the development process itself so that we're building with that insight baked in. And so, like companies like ours, companies working on like safety and mental health really want to work with clinicians and like find how we can like understand these vulnerabilities better. And like as part of like what we are doing, we're trying to put out research, trying to put out white papers to show what we found, where the models fall short. But the more insight, more expertise we get, the better we're able to kind of get a clearer picture of how the safety is. But I think right now the information is just like coming from so many different sources. It's very different in how people are approaching this topic that it's hard to find a great resource that will give direct information, especially as these models are involving the form factors people are using and how people are engaging with AI like change every day. So I think trying to just like keep on seeing like everybody's work on this, people who are approaching it from different angles, and we're trying to assimilate the information into our tool as well. And there's like a lot of interesting research, and I think, like a couple years from now, it will be much safer because we'll have more information to be making these decisions off of.
Where can people find out more about the work that you're doing and how to stay up to date with what you're doing?
Our website, circuitbreakerlabs.ai, has more information about the product. If you're, a clinician looking to build in the space, we're happy to work with you to support your stress testing. Or if you're a clinician just excited about this industry, excited about knowing where safety is going in the mental health domain, we would love to, be able to like benefit from your expertise. And there are ways to like reach out to us on our website as well. Or, Arul and I are accessible on email, Shirali at circuitbreakerlabs.ai, Arul at circuitbreakerlabs.ai. So please do reach out if you're interested. We would love to, like talk more and really understand what you all are seeing in this space, what your patients are leaning towards, how you're thinking about this, and, honestly, like what your vision for how AI interacts with mental health should be so we can kind of help people realize this and put it into practice. We are also active on LinkedIn, so feel free to look us up and we would love to engage with you all.
And we will include links to that in our show notes over at mtsgpodcast.com. Follow us on our social media, join our Facebook group, the Modern Therapist Group, to continue on with this and other conversations. And until next time, I'm Curt Widhelm with Katie Vernoy and Arul and Shirali Nigam.
If running your practice feels like too many moving parts, Simple Practice pulls scheduling, billing, and client communication into one place.
Start with a 7-day free trial, then get 50% off your first 3 months at simplepractice.com.
You became a therapist to help people, not to spend your nights chasing invoices, troubleshooting software, or managing contractors and employees. It's time to stop wearing every hat in your business.
Visit buyingtimellc.com/MTSG to download your free systems inventory checklist and see what becomes possible when you have an entire team buying back your time.
Thank you for listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. Learn more about who we are and what we do at mtsgpodcast.com. You can also join us on Facebook and Twitter. And please don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our episodes.